Thank you very much. Good morning. Palestine is a clear case in which the naming of the colonial condition has been delayed or avoided for so long, for too long. This lack of naming exposes an uneven application of principles and human rights. This lack of naming prolongs injustice and delays the application of human rights standards. We are here today to name the genocide. There's an increasing number of experts, human rights organizations, UN committees, commissions of inquiries, and UN officials who are increasingly willing to say that Israel is committing and has been committing another Nakba, another genocide. For example, on the 13th of May, Tom Fletcher, the UN's Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, asked the UN Security Council, for those killed and those whose voices are silenced, what more evidence do you need now? Will you act decisively to prevent genocide and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law? End of quote. But today, we need to ask another question. The fact that this is not the first genocide that Zionism has inflicted on the Palestinians, and the fact that we commemorated the Nakba anniversary twice during this genocide, compels us to ask, what evidence is more needed for everyone to realize the nature of Israel and the nature of Zionism? Naming requires the recognition of historical context. In his 1963 letter from the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King rejected what he called a superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. Yet, in the context of Palestine, especially after October 2023, we have seen a fierce attack on any attempt at contextualizing Palestinian and Israeli actions. There was a massive campaign, an aggressive discourse that sought to portray the 7th of October as a freestanding event devoid of history. Despite this campaign, which sought to justify Israel's genocide under the banner of self-defense, the genocidal assault on the Palestinian people since October 2023 requires a consideration of the context in which it unfolded. This context includes the nature of Zionism as a settler colonial movement, the unlawful and prolonged occupation since 1967, the apartheid system imposed on all Palestinians, and the 17 years of unlawful siege imposed on Gaza prior to October. These conditions that Israel imposed on the Palestinian people make the Palestinians in Gaza in particular vulnerable to annihilation. And they also indicate an ideology of Jewish supremacy that is infused with a clear, long-standing and demonstrable intent to dehumanize, to discriminate against, to dominate, to subordinate, to dispossess and expel the Palestinians from their homeland. In July 2024, the International Court of Justice laid bare much of this pre-October 2023 reality in a detailed advisory opinion that emphasized that Gaza and the West Bank are a single territorial unit in which the Palestinian people are deprived of the right to self-determination and are subjected to an ongoing, unlawful use of force and a set of discriminatory policies that amount to racial segregation or apartheid and a coercive environment to force them to leave their homeland. But already in its December 2023 application to the ICJ, South Africa highlighted that this genocide is part of a continuum, the 75-year-long apartheid, the 56-year-long belligerent occupation, and the 16-year-long blockade of Gaza that preceded the application. The consensus that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza and that Zionism is indefensible is increasing because the evidence is overwhelming. The world has witnessed innumerable crimes committed against so many for so long in plain sight. But we need to be careful of the recent revisionism that seeks to justify the prolonged silence of so many in the face of the most barbaric crime in our lifetime, definitely in this century. According to this line, Israel's war evolved into a genocide after Israel violated the ceasefire and declared a siege on Gaza in March 2025, and then launched another round of brutal military assault that seeks to drive Palestinians out of Gaza, called Gideon's chariots. These revisionists are pretending that there is something new in Smotrich's recent statement, that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were not members of the Security Cabinet, which is constitutionally responsible for the war policy since October, and that Netanyahu's political survival depended on them, did not depend on them on October 2023 as much as now. They are pretending that the problem is reducible to Netanyahu when we have seen an endless supply of genocidal statements and public letters by senior commanders of the army. But Israel's genocidal intent and genocidal conduct were clear from the start to all those who have been willing and able to see the facts and to listen to what Israeli politicians and soldiers have repeatedly said. It was clear from the intensity and speed of the aerial bombardment. Within less than a week of the start of its attack on Gaza in October, Israel had dropped on the small and densely populated strip more explosive than the US dropped on Afghanistan in a year. Within 3 weeks after the start of the attack, Israel dropped on the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs. It was also clear from the casualties figures, including the proportion of women and children killed and the rate of killing. By mid-2024, the number of those killed in Gaza already exceeded the number of the Rohingya killed in Myanmar, and it exceeded the monthly mortality rate that we witnessed in Bosnia in the early 1990s. It was clear also from the comprehensive scope of the destruction that includes non-military targets and makes the Gaza Strip uninhabitable because it deprives the population from objects that are indispensable for their survival as a group. It was also clear from the scale and the pace of the forcible expulsions in October 2023 and the repeated displacements to an area that the ICJ declared in May 2024 as unfit for human survival, where the civilians were repeatedly bombed. It was also clear from the prolonged imposition of a total siege after October 2023 and the scale and the speed of the policy of starvation, which experts repeatedly labeled as unprecedented. It was also clear from the attack on what was called then the last refuge of Rafah, despite the ICJ's third round of provisional measures back in May 2024. It was also clear from a military operation that effectively implemented the so-called General's Plan in North Gaza from October to December 2024, and which was dubbed at the time as ethnic cleansing and a genocide within a genocide. The totality of these actions indicates the commission of genocidal acts and the existence of a genocidal intent that is inferred from these actions and this context, and therefore it precludes security and military justifications. The recent campaign of starvation, mass displacement, and mass slaughter, called Gideon's chariots, is merely the culmination of this genocidal war on the Palestinians, perhaps the final stage of it. While the International Court's jurisprudence has imposed a high threshold for the determination of genocidal intent, the imposition of such a threshold is problematic as it would undermine the purpose and the utility of the Genocide Convention. The problematic nature of this jurisprudence is clear, considering the sustained criticism of the rulings of the ICJ concerning the genocide in Bosnia, including by the 6 Western states, Germany and the UK included, in their submission to the ICJ in the Gambia versus Myanmar case. The increasing consensus that Israel is committing a genocide shows that even by the yardstick of the high legal threshold in the ICJ, Israel's conduct in Gaza have clearly and demonstrably passed this threshold. South Africa has provided a comprehensive documentation of Israeli genocidal statements and incitement to genocide in its February 2025 submission to the UN Security Council. It also detailed the patterns of conduct that illustrate that Israel acts with genocidal intent. These patterns of conduct, some of which will be discussed later today, include the pattern of Israel targeting the vulnerable, including children, women, the wounded, the disabled, and those who have repeatedly been displaced and sought shelter. The pattern of Israel denying humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza and the associated policy of starvation. The pattern of Israel creating unbearable living conditions for the Palestinians in Gaza. The pattern of Israel targeting those trying to help and protect Palestinians, including medical and humanitarian personnel. The pattern of Israel's forcible transfer and displacement of Palestinians in and out of Gaza. The pattern of complete disregard for the laws of war. The pattern of the failure to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and the pattern of destroying Palestinian life in Gaza. These patterns of conduct, which Israel maintained for a lengthy period in contravention of 3 sets of ICJ provisional measures to prevent genocide, and despite repeated warnings from international humanitarian organizations, and with full knowledge of the impact of its policies on the vulnerable Palestinian population in Gaza, provides sufficient evidence of Israel's intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such. We need not, of course, wait for formal pronouncements by courts to call a spade, to take a clear moral and political stance in opposition to mass slaughter and mass destruction, because our moral and political judgment is not reducible to formal legal rulings. There is an urgent task now to educate against genocide denial, to act to end the genocide, and to hold Israel and its leaders and soldiers accountable for the genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But it is equally urgent to end the brutal occupation and dismantle the apartheid system that made the genocide possible. And it is equally important to defeat the legal sophistry and the ideological structures that dehumanized the Palestinians and justified the Nakba in 1948 and then the genocide in Gaza now and made them palatable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Soltani, for grounding the rest of our conversation today. I'd like to next introduce Professor Victor Kattan, who's going to be joining us online. He's Assistant Professor of Public International Law at Nottingham University in England. In this position, he also serves as the Deputy Director of the Nottingham International Law and Security Center. He holds law degrees from Brunel University and the University of Leiden, with a PhD in international law from the School of Law at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. He previously taught at the National University of Singapore and has served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian Negotiation Affairs Department in Ramallah. Professor Kattan is the author of From Coexistence to Conquest, International Law and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1891 to 1949, and is the editor or co-editor of a number of books on international law. So without more, can we get Victor Kattan?
So it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak about a topic that has never been more urgent, apartheid and the continued denial of the Palestinian people's rights to self-determination. And what I thought would be helpful for me to focus on in my remarks this morning is to focus on apartheid as a crime, that is, as a crime against humanity. So while apartheid is mentioned in foundational treaties and conventions on international human rights and treaties that purport to protect civilians in international humanitarian law, it's important to note that these treaties do not define apartheid. To understand apartheid and to look for its definition, we must turn to international criminal law. And this is what the focus of my presentation will be today. So apartheid is defined as a crime against humanity in 2 conventions. The first convention is the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid of 1973, and subsequently in the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court but it was first conventionally classified as a crime against humanity in a rather unknown convention on the non-applicability of statutory limitations to war crimes and crimes against humanity. That convention is important to mention because that's the first time there emerged a distinction between global North states and global South states over the definition of these crimes. And in the debate in the United Nations in 1968, the global North states were very much still wedded to and focused on the crimes that occurred in during the Third Reich in Nazi-occupied Germany, mainly genocide. And the global South states said, while they were not opposed to having a convention making it clear that for such crimes there would be no statutory limitation for them, they insisted on extending the notion of crimes against humanity to include new crimes that had emerged since the Second World War, namely apartheid. At that time, the global North states were opposed to this extension of crimes against humanity to include apartheid, and so they did not become party to that convention. And one of the arguments they made is that there was not a definition of apartheid in international law. This omission was remedied in 1973 when the global South states pushed through the political organs of the United Nations a convention that was modeled on the Genocide Convention, but that defined apartheid as a crime against humanity. And then following the end of apartheid in South Africa, global North states felt comfortable ratifying the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which defines apartheid in Article 7 as a crime against humanity. So we can see that it's a crime that began largely as a global South crime, but that over time has become a crime that applies to all states. And it's important to emphasize that today, those states that are parties to the ICC statute are largely from the global North, to the extent that about 167 states have ratified one of these conventions. So a strong argument can be made that the crime against humanity of apartheid reflects customary international law. And that's important to emphasize because some countries, including Israel and the United States of America, are not parties to any of these treaties. So it's important for me to emphasize that the crime is most likely customary international law. Now, given the focus of this tribunal on Gaza, I thought it would be important to look at the relationship between the way in which apartheid is defined as a crime and genocide. So apartheid is defined in the 1973 Apartheid Convention in Article 2, and it lists a number of what they call inhuman acts. Now, some of these acts are classical acts in ordinary criminal law. Some of them are broader and would include violations of civil, political, and economic rights. So apartheid is defined, it focuses, if you like, on the structure of government and the institutions of government, on the system that gives rise to these multiple violations. And it's a system that imposes a hierarchy. There is a privileged group, a racial group, and I'll talk about that very shortly, that maintains domination over other groups. So it's a system that implies permanent subordination of those groups and a system of hierarchy. And we'll see this definition appear in the ICC statute. But what's important here is that Article 2 has language that directly corresponds to those in the Genocide Convention. So it explains that the crime of apartheid will include the following inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them, and then includes under this category murder of these groups, infliction upon members of these groups serious bodily or mental harm, and then finally deliberate imposition on these groups of living conditions calculated to cause their physical destruction in whole or in part. And I've underlined and put in bold those words which also correspond to those to the definition of genocide in the 1948 Genocide Convention. And of course, it goes without saying that any system of domination implies a denial of self-determination. And we can see these 3 years ago, the then UN Special Rapporteur, Michael Link, very helpfully summarized the three-part legal definition of the crime of apartheid based on the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute. And I should note that this approach was endorsed by a number of judges in their separate opinions in last summer's advisory opinion on Israel's policies and practices in the occupied territories. Firstly, there must exist an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination. This regime must be established with the intent to maintain domination of one racial group over another, and the regime must feature inhumane or inhuman acts committed as an integral part of the regime. I should say that one of the distinctions between the definition of apartheid in the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute is that the Rome Statute introduces this language of institutionalized regime, and it also it also links all of the inhumane acts as additional crimes against humanity. So in other words, apartheid describes the kind of political, structural, legislative context in which multiple crimes against humanity occur. And these would include murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation or forcible transfer of people, torture, rape, persecution, etc. So it's the system under which all of these crimes occur. I think it's also important to emphasize that although the Apartheid Convention, and the word apartheid is a word from the Afrikaans language, and it was originally conceptualized as applying to a particular part of the world, namely Southern Africa, it is intriguing when you look at the drafting of the Apartheid Convention that Israel's policies and practices, its oppression of the Palestinian people was raised. It was raised during the drafting of the convention by Egypt, Syria, and Morocco, who insisted on introducing language that would cover Israel's crimes. For example, one of the inhumane acts that is listed is denying people the right to return to their homeland. So you'll find that mentioned in the definition of apartheid, and that was introduced by Egypt and Syria in the negotiation process in 1972 when their territories had recently been occupied by Israel in the June 1967 war. And then during the term of the treaty monitoring body known as the Group of Three, which operated between 1978 and 1995, Israel's policies and practices were the most frequently mentioned after South Africa's policies in South Africa and Namibia. So when you look at the reports that were submitted by the states parties to the Group of Three on the application of that convention, they didn't restrict it to South Africa and Namibia. They interpreted the convention as being more broadly applicable, and many states included what Israel was doing to the Palestinians as falling within the definition of apartheid. So this is going from the 1970s to the 1990s. And then, of course, when the ICC statute was adopted in 1998, after the fall or after the end of apartheid in South Africa, which provided only for prospective application, then this necessarily, of course, included any policies and practices of apartheid going forward, which would include what is happening in inside Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So before I end my remarks, I just want to mention something about the notion of racial groups, because the way in which the convention is drafted, it refers to a domination by one racial group over another. And critics of the claim that Israel is practicing apartheid often say, well, you know, Palestinians and Israelis are not racial groups. But I think this misrepresents the way in which the notion of racial groups is understood in the convention. So at the time of the drafting of the convention, the main focus, of course, was on Southern Africa, where the concept of a racial group was statutorily defined in the Population Registration Act and in the Group Areas Act as including ethnic, linguistic, cultural, national, and tribal groups. And of course, Israelis and Palestinians could be described as different ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and national groups. I've also, if you look also at the way in which the term racial groups has been understood in the domestic laws of states parties to the ICC statute, you'll see that they rarely pair race alone or racial groups alone. They always link it to another descriptive identity, including nationality, national origin, religion, ethnicity, color, etc. And this was also the case with the 1973 Apartheid Convention. So the states parties to that convention, when they sought to give legal effect domestically to the convention, interpreted racial groups more broadly than just race. So to conclude, I think some of the unique contributions that the Gaza Tribunal can make is to focus on apartheid as a crime against humanity. It remains the case that until this day, there is no jurisprudence, either in the domestic courts or international courts on apartheid as a crime against humanity. Although the International Court of Justice helpfully described the kind of systemic forms of discrimination inside the West Bank, its interpretation was narrowly construed to the application of international human rights conventions to occupied territories. They avoided focusing on the definition of apartheid as a crime. Only about 4 or 5 of the judges did that in their separate opinions. The relationship between the crime of apartheid and the crime of genocide has arisen, however, in 2 contentious cases before the International Court of Justice. A lot of attention has been focused rightfully on South Africa against Israel, but it has also arisen in the case that Nicaragua has brought against Germany. But of course, we don't know what the International Court will say, when they might say it, or if they say anything useful. So I think, again, this is another aspect that the tribunal can focus on. And then, of course, it's been raised in proceedings at the International Criminal Court, but we all know of the difficulties that is currently facing that court. And so I'd encourage the tribunal to perhaps look at the relationship between apartheid and genocide, as it is so obviously patently applicable, and sadly, to what is happening in Gaza and in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories. Thank you very much.
In any proceedings which look to evaluate the conduct of an individual or a state with respect to alleged crimes, the role of the lawyer is to look at 2 related elements. First is the law, and we've heard that already from both Victor and Nimer with respect to the issues of apartheid and genocide. But the second is equally important, and that is the facts. Lawyers deal intensely with both features when they write, when they make up their minds, when they plead before courts, and when judges wind up deliberating and coming to decisions on the quality of the legal arguments and the evidence that's presented before them. Susan and I are now tasked with sharing with you a taste of some of this evidence arising from genocide in Gaza. These testimonies that we're going to be reading to you over the next few minutes come from a collection of witness statements shared by Bidal, Al-Haq, and Adamir, 3 of the leading Palestinian human rights organizations operating in the West Bank and in Gaza. Susan is going to read 2 of them. I'm going to read 2 of them. And I'm going to start with one now. And we're going to try to make sure that these testimonies stay within the realm of about 10 minutes each in order for it to be digestible by you. And then once the 4 are read, we'll have a discussion with Nimer with respect to his presentation, and we'll be taking questions. Okay, yes, and we also have a video that's going to be shown as well. So let me lead off with a written statement. I'm reading from the English by a field worker at Al-Haq working in Gaza.
كنت أعيش في شقة مساحتها 200 متر تقع في الطابق الثالث من عمارة الشارقة المكونة من 7 طبقات. حياتي كانت هادئة جدا مع أسرتي المكونة من زوجتي وأطفالي ال3، خالد 16 عاما، ليان 14 عاما، وآدم 9 سنوات. في اليوم الثالث من بداية حرب الإبادة الإسرائيلية، وتحديدا بتاريخ 9 أكتوبر 23، كنت في العمل، واتصلت زوجتي تخبرني بورود اتصالات من الجيش الإسرائيلي يأمر السكان بإخلاء البنايات السكنية المجاورة لمنزلي على الفور لكي تقصفها الطائرات الحربية الإسرائيلية، بالرغم أنها بنايات سكنية مدنية ولا يوجد سبب لذلك أبدا. عدت مسرعا من العمل، وما أن وصلت حتى ورد نفس الاتصال لأحد سكان بنايتنا بضرورة الإخلاء فورا. لم يتركوا لنا وقت لكي نحمل أي ملابس أو حتى حقائب مدرسة أطفالي. 5 دقائق فقط بعد الاتصال قصفت طائرات الاحتلال المبنى الذي أسكن فيه وكافة المباني المحيطة، فدمرتها بالكامل. نجوت أنا وعائلتي بأعجوبة من موت محقق، لأن القصف وقع بينما كنا أسفل البناية، ومن شدة الخوف ترك ابني الصغير آدم يد أمه وأراد الهرب، فدخل بالخطأ لداخل البناية وسط الطائر الركام والدخان، وعم الصراخ والهلع في صفوف السكان المدنيين. دخلت لكي أبحث عن ابني بين الركام والدخان الكثيف بينما كان القصف مستمرا. وجدت طفلي يحتمي خلف الباب السفلي للبناية مرعوبا، فحملته وخرجنا بعيدا، وأصبحنا بلا مأوى بعد تدمير منزلي. بعدها نزحت أنا وأسرتي لمنزل أهل زوجتي في المدينة، فتركت أسرتي وكنت أبيت لمواصلة عملي في توثيق القتلى والجرحى في مستشفى الشفاء بغزة. كانت أعداد القتلى والجرحى بسبب أعمال القصف المتواصل كبيرة جدا، تصل في نفس الوقت ومن عدة أماكن في المدينة. كنت أشاهد أجلاء الأطفال والنساء تتساقط على الأرض في أقسام المستشفى. لم يتمكن الأطباء من السيطرة على هذا المشهد المروع بسبب كثرة أعداد القتلى وحاجة الجرحى المشوهين لتلقي العلاج. بعد يومين طلبت قوات الاحتلال من سكان منطقة أهل زوجتي الإخلاء فورا، فأخليت أسرتي لمنزل أخي في منطقة مجاورة، ثم واصلت العمل في المستشفى. بعدها وبتاريخ 13 أكتوبر من العام 2023 أمرت قوات الاحتلال بإخلاء مدينتي غزة وشمال غزة بالكامل تمهيدا لغزو بري شامل، وتزامنت أوامر الإخلاء القسري مع قصف جوي ومدفعي مكثف لجميع مناطق غزة وشمال غزة لإرغام الناس على الإخلاء السريع، فسقط المئات من القتلى والجرحى بسبب القصف العنيف. غادرنا غزة بعد إخلاء المدينة قسرا، حيث أجبرت آلاف الأسر على التوجه لمناطق جنوب وادي غزة سيرا على الأقدام لنحو 20 كيلومترا، وذهبنا إلى منزل أختي بدير البلح وسط القطاع، وأقمنا مع العشرات من أفراد العائلة والأقارب والمعارف في منزل أختي المقتض. قضينا شهرين في ظروف قاسية للغاية. كنا نعاني من نقص حاد في الغذاء والماء والرعاية الطبية بسبب إغلاق الاحتلال للمعابر ومنعه دخول المواد الغذائية. قضينا طوال الوقت تحت قصف جوي متواصل، ولم أكن أعتقد أننا سننجو من الموت. لم نكن نملك ملابس ولا أغطية، وكان الجو باردا جدا خاصة في الليل. كنا نجمع الحطب من الأراضي المحيطة للطبخ والتدفئة. طوال الوقت كان صعب جدا ومكلف جدا الحصول على الطحين والطعام لهذا العدد الكبير من النساء والأطفال والرجال، والكهرباء كانت مقطوعة أيضا، وكنا نعاني كثيرا لتوفير مياه الشرب والمياه الخاصة بالاستحمام. مع إعلان اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار 1 نوفمبر من العام 2023 غادرت أنا وعائلتي إلى رفح، وأقمنا مع عدد كبير من أفراد العائلة والأقارب في منزل أخي. عانينا بشدة من نقص الطعام والدقيق والماء والرعاية الطبية. قضينا عدة أشهر تحت القصف المتواصل في أنحاء مختلفة من المدينة. نجونا بعجوبة أكثر من مرة من الموت بسبب قصف المنازل والمنشآت المدنية المجاورة. قتل العديد من أقاربي، منهم أطفال ونساء، نتيجة القصف المتواصل. كما ودمرت قوات الاحتلال جميع منازل إخوتي وأخواتي، وكان طوال الوقت عدد القتلى والجرحى المدنيين يتصاعد يوما بعد يوم. كما واصلت قوات الاحتلال قصف وتدمير المباني السكنية والمستشفيات والطرق والبنية التحتية، ومنعت إدخال المساعدات والمياه والمواد الغذائية. في مطلع مايو أيار من 2024 أمرت قوات الاحتلال بإخلاء رفح. اضطررت أنا وعائلتي للعيش في خيمة في مواصي خان يونس لمدة عام كامل. خلال هذه الفترة عانينا من الجوع والعطش ونقص الملابس والرعاية الطبية وبرد الشتاء وحر الصيف الشديد. شددت قوات الاحتلال إغلاق المعابر ومنعت دخول المساعدات، وكانت أسعار السلع والمواد الغذائية مرتفعة للغاية، وصلت إلى 1000% طوال فترة الحرب. أغلقت البنوك ومنعت قوات الاحتلال إدخال العملات النقدية، مما تسبب لي بخسران ثلث راتبي شهريا بسبب نقص السيولة النقدية ونسبة العمولة التي نجبر على إعطائها للتجار الذين نستلم منهم الأموال النقدية، والتي تتجاوز نسبة 30% من راتبي شهريا. كانت الحياة في خيمة مع آلاف النازحين من حولنا صعبة للغاية. كنا نكافح للحصول على الماء والطعام. كان سعر كيس الطحين الذي يزن 25 كيلوغراما يصل إلى $500، وكان سعر كيلوغرام الخضروات أكثر من $30. خسرت كل مدخراتي خلال أشهر الحرب الأولى لتوفير الطعام لعائلتي وأقاربي، والمساعدات كانت شحيحة جدا والمحتاجين لها كثر. خلال عملي وثقت وفاة الكثير من الأطفال في خيام النازحين بسبب البرد القارس وقلة الأغذية، وكذلك نتيجة سوء التغذية وقلة الطعام واعتماد النازحين على إشعال النار في الخيام، ونتيجة قصف خيام النازحين في مواصي خان يونس وهم نائمون. وقد قتل والدي وهو نائم نتيجة قصف خيمته بلا أي سبب. وفي شهر فبراير من العام 2025 هبت رياح شديدة وسقطت أمطار قوية. اقتلعت الرياح خيمتنا المقامة في العراء ودمرت بالكامل. وقتها بحثت عن مأوى آخر فلم أجد خيام، حتى وجدت شقة صغيرة مساحتها حوالي 60 مترا مربع، وقمت باستئجارها بمبلغ يصل إلى $800 شهريا، حيث بسبب تدمير الآلاف من المباني والمنازل ارتفعت أسعار الشقق والسلع والمياه. لم تصمد للهدنة سوى شهر ونصف، وعادت السلع والمواد الغذائية لتصبح شحيحة في الأسواق وبتلاعب التجار بأسعارها، وعادت نسبة العمولة على النقد تنغص حياتنا المريرة وسط الحرب والقصف اليومي. وأنا أخسر أكثر من نصف راتبي شهريا بسبب العمولة والإيجار، ولا يكفي الباقي للحصول على الطعام باقي أيام الشهر نتيجة ارتفاع الأسعار. نعيش منذ مدة على وجبة طعام واحدة في اليوم. الطعام معلب وغالي وغير صحي، والماء غير نظيف، ومع ذلك نشربه رغما عنا. المياه العادية شحيحة جدا، وأدوات النظافة غير متوفرة. الدواء غير متوفر بسبب الحصار الإسرائيلي ومنع إدخال المساعدات. أصبت بمرض مزمن، بمرض ضغط الدم خلال الحرب. مرات أجد العلاج ومرات أكثر لا أحصل عليه. أوثق وفاة مدنيين بشكل يومي بسبب سوء التغذية، خاصة بين الأطفال، كما أن الجوع متفشي بين الناس وخاصة الأطفال والنساء. وتعج أقسام المستشفيات بالمرضى بأمراض مزمنة لا يتوفر لهم علاج. فلقد دمرت إسرائيل كل مصادر الغذاء ومخازن المواد الغذائية وقطاعات الزراعة والثروة السمكية، ومنعت إدخال الطعام، واستخدمت التجويع سلاح إبادة ضد المدنيين في قطاع غزة. وتهدد إسرائيل بتوسيع العملية العسكرية على قطاع غزة وتهجير المدنيين قسرا خارج أرضهم. نعيش حالة من التيه والهلع وترقب الموت بأي لحظة. لا نستطيع مغادرة غزة بسبب الإغلاق. أطفالنا بلا تعليم، والمرض والهزل ينهش أجسادنا. وصلنا لحالة من نفاذ الطعام بالكامل، والجوع قاتل، ولا مياه تكفي بسبب إصرار الاحتلال على قطع المياه والطاقة والطعام عن قطاع غزة بالكامل. لن يصمد الناس هنا كثيرا نتيجة إصرار إسرائيل على مواصلة الإبادة الجماعية بحق المدنيين في قطاع غزة، وتوفير المجتمع الدولي الغطاء الكافي لإفلات إسرائيل من العقاب على الانتهاكات الصارخة للقانون الدولي، واستمرار الإبادة الجماعية بحق الشعب الفلسطيني.
The next three testimonies that we will be reading are from the Badil Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights. We're very grateful to Badil for providing us these testimonies, which provide facts about repeated forced displacement that Palestinians have been suffering long before last October. Aya Khalid Isa Abu Sharh, 22 years old, from North Gaza, Beit Lahia. I was living with my parents, and we were a family of 9 members, consisting of my parents, in addition to siblings. We lived inside a residential apartment with an area of about 120 people in a residential building, with 5 layers, with 10 housing units. Since the first day of the genocidal war at 6:30, while I was sleeping, I woke up to the sound of explosions. It felt like lightning or thunder, and I did not understand what was happening and what these explosions were. The first week was very painful, and the situation was dangerous. Several places in the vicinity were targeted. And on October 24th, at about 10 p.m., while we were inside the apartment, I heard the sound of an explosion and a large fire, which led to the flying of a large number of shrapnel and damage to a large number of towers, and damage to the apartment as well. And the next morning, on October 24th, we were displaced and evacuated to Hamad Secondary School. We stayed inside the corridor of a classroom for 1 day, and the next day I returned to the apartment. Suddenly we received warnings that several towers were targeted, so we fled to the corridor of one of the classrooms in Hamad School again. We slept in the corridor without bringing any blankets or mattresses. We stayed for a week due to the dangerous situation and the shells falling near us and next to the school. And on October 20th, at about 2 p.m., we went to Al Ayun Hospital. We stayed in a room in the hospital with my sister, my mother, and my brothers in difficult living situation amid the sounds of explosions that do not subside. The atmosphere was very scary, and at the beginning of November, when the occupation army entered the hospital where we were and shot at the facilities and buildings of the hospital on the same day, artillery shells fell on the 3rd floor of the hospital, which caused great damage that led to the martyrdom of 4 people and several injuries, in addition to shooting at people inside the hospital, where we spent a whole night under shelling and shooting, and the appeals to the Red Cross, media outlet, and activists to get us out of the hospital. And at 7 o'clock, we left the hospital yard. Military vehicles, tanks, bulldozers, and a large deployment of soldiers were there. The situation was terrifying, and we were very afraid. We left on foot to the Shujaiya area east of Gaza. We left amid explosions and violent shelling from the occupation vehicles everywhere. The journey of the march and the journey of displacement was harsh, as if it was a journey towards death. We walked towards Nitsarim checkpoint, a checkpoint of the occupation forces who completely separated the north and south and set up military checkpoints throughout the area that separates northern Gaza from the south. We arrived at Nitsarim checkpoint at about 4 p.m. There were thousands of displaced people, and the presence of military vehicles on Salah ad-Din Street, and the presence of a large number of occupation soldiers on sand beams who were pointing their weapons at us. We saw many bodies of people who were killed, bodies lying on the ground. And next to the road, I saw burned people inside a car that was bombed, with the bodies remaining inside. We went to the area of Nuseirat camp and stayed with people who are friends of my brother-in-law. We stayed with them for 2 days. Then we went to the Sardi school of UNRWA and stayed for a day. Then we went to a relative's house in the Khirbat al-Adas area in Rafah and stayed for 15 days to be displaced again. On the November 23rd, in a building in Nuseirat camp, we stayed until January 1st to be displaced again to the city of Rafah, near the agency's barracks in one tent It was a primitive tent consisting of a few sticks and plastic bags. My father refused to move with us to areas south of the Gaza Valley and stayed inside the preparatory school near the Palm Hall. At the end of November, the transmission was cut off for more than a week without the ability to communicate with my father and brothers. And the day before his martyrdom, on December 23rd, we contacted my father after many attempts and a complete break in communications. My brother Muhammad called me to check on my father at 9 p.m. while my father was leaving the school. He was leaving the school to fetch bread. He was shot while he was in the vicinity of the school and remained lying for many hours in the street without the ability to retrieve him or rescue him. Everyone who tried to rescue him was shot at, and after 2 hours, he was retrieved. The news was received with great sadness without being able to say goodbye or bury him. Until now, I mourn the loss of my father. His loss is painful and cruel. On May 24th, we were displaced to Khan Yunis, west of the city, near the Sharia court in a tent. We stayed for about 6 months, living in difficult, harsh, and painful conditions. Until now, we live in conditions of severe famine, without bread or flour, a complete loss of vegetables and fruits, and the high price of them has become a dream. It has become a dream for us to eat bread for more than 3 weeks. And alternatives to bread are also impossible. The high prices have reached all items, and we live now only in the worst conditions and forms of war. These days are indescribable. They're days of death, famine, fear, and horror.
I'm going to read a statement given to Badil by Khalid Walid Rabi al-Tum, 32 years old, living in Khan Yunis. He said, on the first day of the genocidal war, I was living with my wife and my son Walid, 6 years old, in a 110-meter apartment in the residential tower in Gaza City's Sheikh Radwan neighborhood, with my parents living next to me in an apartment opposite my apartment, along with my brothers Mahmoud and Yamin. We received the first day of the war with great fear and panic. As we lived in the middle of death, in the middle of the bombardment, the land of Shanti was behind us, as well as the El Kurama neighborhood, and in front of us was the El Nasser neighborhood. So these neighborhoods were under heavy shelling and fire belts since the morning of the 8th of October. The El Kurima neighborhood, which was less than half a kilometer away from us, in addition to the adhesion of Shanti land, this thing doubled the impact of the war on us, as we felt that we were on the crater of a volcano. Hundreds of missiles, hundreds of bombs were dropped in these neighborhoods since the first several days of the war. At 7 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, the 12th of October, while I was in the apartment with my family, as well as the presence of my parents in the apartment next to me, we suddenly heard the sound of a huge, large explosion. And with seconds, a cloud of smoke filled the place, in addition to the flying of much shrapnel, which was clearly audible. This created a state of hysteria and extreme fear with my wife and my child Walid, who burst into tears, and his mother was trying to calm him by hugging him and trying to explain it is fireworks, and these are people having fun in the street. He didn't believe her. The dust and the smoke were stronger than any attempt to calm or reassure, accompanied by the sound of ambulances and the cries of the martyrs' families echoing in the place. The scenes were cruel and shocking, and I immediately went down to participate in the evacuation of the martyrs and the injured. The targeting was in the tower adjacent to us, especially for the apartment adjacent to us as well, the apartment owned by the Labad family, and includes 9 other residential units that were targeted. The bombing resulted in the martyrdom of 8 people from the same family, In addition to the injury of more than 40 citizens, from neighbors and passers-by, the scenes of the martyrs were harsh. Most of the bodies were burned. Others were pieces of nothing but small bits of flesh. Children were running away from the street from the ugliness of the scenes. How can children see such scenes? And I was not able to do so. As a result of this bombing, in addition to the intensification of the fierce shelling that did not stop, we were forced to leave the tower with my family and my parents' family, in addition to 3 other families who were displaced in the apartment of by my parents' family to the west of Gaza City. These displaced families went to Hamama School near the El Ala Club in the Sheikh Redwan neighborhood. And I was also displaced with my family to a home with the Shabir family, our friends in the far east of Sheikh Redwan neighborhood. And we stayed there one day without food, without drink, and because of the heavy shelling as well as lack of sleep, and we spent 24 hours dying of suffering, anxiety, fear, and great panic. We spent those 24 hours living with the dread of what may to come. So the next day, the Friday, we fled to the house of my Aunt Shireen in the Safatawi area west of Jabalia camp. And while we were at the house, my aunt fled to the southern Gaza Strip, along with thousands of families who were fleeing on foot from death and did not know where to go. What was her fate? And will she have shelter? And what will this shelter be? We couldn't accept the idea of displacement while listening to dozens of massacres in the central and southern governorates. So finally, we decided to stay at my aunt's home, but this stay did not last long. 3 days later, on the 16th of October, under the weight of relentless bombardment, the latest of which was the targeting of a house of the Nasman family right next to us, destroying it on the heads of its inhabitants and killing everyone who was in the house, in order for us to escape quickly from the house without thought or question. All that was in our imagination was trying to escape our fate. At 10 a.m. on that day, we fled from the Satawatawi area and did not know where to go. We didn't know where was safe. We didn't know which was the right way to escape from death and where and when we could ever rest. In the end, we headed to the home of my mother's family, located in the North Beach area. And we rested for the first day and were able to sleep after a journey of fatigue and after days of sleeplessness and extreme anxiety. The next day, the sounds of shelling also intensified, caused by targeting the western areas of Gaza City from the intelligence and even the beach camp where we were. But we were affected ourselves to stay and not to go to the southern areas. We stayed at home for a few days, and then on the 24th, I received the news of the bombing of the tower that contains my apartment, as well as my parents' apartment, in its complete destruction. That tower collapsed, and the memories and everything that brought us together collapsed as well. So I felt great sadness, not only for the loss of the homes, but for the loss of my belongings inside the apartment, and all that it represented to my wife and my child, that he left behind many of his toys that he loved, and the photo albums that held us together were also destroyed as well. To remain living in harsh conditions, and at the beginning of the intensification of the living crisis, as there was no food left in the markets as a result of the occupation deliberately from the first day of the genocidal war to cut off all food supplies, all water, all fuel, and all electricity. We were struggling to provide drinking water, and I was standing in queues for long days, and some days I could not provide it. As the markets disappeared, the shops were destroyed. We couldn't find anything to eat, and the price of a bag of flour reached more than $150. We lived through bitter days and great suffering, and with the beginning of the actual arrival of the military vehicles and tanks from the Israeli army from the beach and Nassa area, and the indiscriminate fall of shelling and the peak of the famine stage, our faces turned pale, and we were left with no choice but to head to southern Gaza Valley or stay and die in Gaza. Due to the difficult and harsh psychological state of my son Walid, as well as the rest of my family members, I forced them to leave and move to southern Gaza. And at 8 a.m. in the morning of the 19th of November, I took my wife and Walid, in addition to my family, and traveled on the road between walking on foot for long distances and sometimes hitching a ride on a cart pulled by a mule, until we all arrived at the Nusrat camp in the central governorate. We had walked on foot for long distances and between a cart pulled by an animal. And there we were able to take a car and arrive at Bir Canada in the city of Rafah in southern Gaza. We fled to the Al-Shifa hospital and were displaced there for 2 days inside the hospital courtyard. And because of the proximity of the occupation to Shifa hospital and the heavy shelling, we had to escape once again to the Al-Dawraj area in eastern Gaza. And when I reached the Palmyra junction, many shells fall on the houses in the vicinity. My foot was hit by shrapnel, and I was treated by a few citizens and taken to one of the local health clinics at Tel Shamar. The injury was simple with a small shrapnel. My wound was superficial and small, and in the same attacks, many people but next to me, ironically, have been killed, including 2 women and a child who were lying very close to me on El Wata Street. No one was able to retrieve their bodies. I was displaced to a friend's home east of Gaza City, and I stayed with him for 3 days, and then I left for the southern Gaza Valley after a harsh journey of pain and displacement, where I walked on foot from the Kuwait roundabout until I reached the El Narazim checkpoint, and it was full of soldiers. And that is an excerpt. Susan.
So our last testimony is from Shireen Mustafa Abdul Qadir Safi, 40 years old, southern Gaza Strip. I was living in a 190-meter apartment in a family building consisting of 3 layers. At 6:30 on Saturday morning, we heard the sounds of explosions and missiles. They were violent and frightening explosions. No one could go to school, and my husband could not go to his work. Then on the 13th at about 11 o'clock in the morning, we heard the news of the martyrdom and burial of members of my husband's family in the Tal al-Zatar area. We heard the news of the martyrdom and burial of his family and a house for the Safi family that had been targeted there, where more than 30 people were martyred as a result. And when my husband returned home, he told me that he saw death with his own eyes in the Tal al-Zatar area. He said, "I saw the remains of the martyred people under the rubble, and at 5 o'clock in the evening of the same day, while my husband was standing in front of the house, he was immediately martyred and became scattered parts. He was recognized by my daughter, Asil, who recognized him through the rest of the clothes that he was wearing. While we were going down the street, another missile fell near us, so we left. We left my husband and fled and left him in the street in pieces." My brother Shadi Safi, 35 years old, and my father-in-law Ali Safi, 60 years old, returned to the place where we left my husband in the street. His name is Muhammad Ali Abdul Qadir Safi, 40 years old. They returned to retrieve him and took him to Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza and buried him in Beit Lahia Cemetery the next day. After that, we were displaced to Osama bin Zaid School in the Safatawi area in northern Gaza, and we stayed there for 2 days in difficult conditions. My brother Shadi came and took us to his house in the Safatawi area, and we stayed a week with him. Difficult conditions. We went then to the Rafidain school in the Jabali al-Balad area, which was very crowded due to the large number of displaced people. And as a result of the shelling and the very difficult living conditions, we decided to leave. And at around 11 o'clock on November 9, we went out on foot because there were no cars towards the Dole roundabout. We all went out, accompanied by my parents and my husband's parents, and when we reached Nusrat, we dispersed. I went to my husband's sister, Manar Safi, in Khan Yunis, and stayed with her for about 2 months. And then on January 16th, we went to the UNRWA Qadila school at 10 p.m. We couldn't carry any blankets, mattresses, or anything. So we headed to Al-Aqsa University, west of Khan Yunis. There was a checkpoint for the occupation army. The army was cursing us. They ordered us to enter, and we were 5 people. But there were thousands of displaced people at the checkpoint. And when we crossed the checkpoint, the occupation army arrested my father-in-law, Ali Abdul Qadir Ali Safi. He was released after 22 days. We headed to Rafah, to the Tala Sultan neighborhood, to a tent inside one of the lands, which consisted of a few pieces of wood and nylon. We made a primitive tent without any breadwinner. At the beginning of the 5th month, we were displaced at El Atar and stayed 2 months inside a tent. The conditions were difficult. And then we went to the Al Baraka camp for orphans. So I have to tell you, we don't know the fate of any of our witnesses whose testimony we're reading today. We're enormously grateful for their testimonials, and these will all be included in the final report of the Gaza Tribunal. And now we're going to hear a video, live video from Gaza, from Ahmed Abu Artama. Ahmed Abu Artama is a Palestinian journalist. No, it's a recorded video. We're going to hear his voice. And a peace activist. He's the author of the book Organized Chaos and numerous articles, and is one of the founders of the Great March of Return. He's a refugee from Al-Ramla village in Palestine, and we're going to run a translation of his recorded testimony.
السلام عليكم، تحية طيبة لكم جميعا. يحدثكم أحمد أبو رتيمة من غزة من تحت الإبادة والتجويع. أعطيكم بداية تعريفا موجزا عن نفسي. أنا أحمد أبو رتيمة، كاتب فلسطيني أنشر في عدد من المواقع الدولية، وأيضا ناشط حقوقي وسياسي. تعرضت من بين 2,000,000 إنسان منذ 1 و8 أشهر إلى كل أصناف الإبادة والتجويع والمعاناة والتهجير القسري. فقدت ابني البكر عبد الله 12 عاما حين قصف بيت عائلتي، وقتل أيضا 6 آخرون في نفس القصف في بيتي، وأصبت أنا بحروق متوسطة، وأصيب أيضا أبنائي الآن في خارج قطاع غزة، وهدم البيت بطبيعة الحال، ثم هدمت أيضا شقتي الخاصة في مدينة خان يونس، ثم أيضا جرفت كل الأراضي المملوكة لوالدي ولإخواني وأشقائي. فلذلك نحن الآن جميع العائلة، ليس فقط العائلة، عائلتي وأقاربي وأبناء أعمام أبي وكل العائلة وكل الأصهار وكل الجيران، كلنا نحن الآن بلا مأوى، لا يوجد ولا حتى بيت واحد لنا، نسكن في خيام منذ أكثر من سنة. سأحدثكم في هذه الرسالة عن مأساة، وهي أحد وجوه هذه المعاناة المرعبة التي يعيشها أهالي قطاع غزة دون توقف منذ 1 و8 أشهر، وهي تجربة النزوح. يسميها جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بأنها أوامر إخلاء، ولكنها في الحقيقة تهجير قسري. الناس هنا يصنفونها بأنها قطعة من العذاب، ويصنفونها بأنها أسوأ من الموت. هناك كثير من الناس في غزة صاروا الآن يقولون بجدية الموت أهون من النزوح، وذلك بسبب ما عانوه وقاسوه من هذه التجربة. الآن بينما أتحدث لكم طبعا صوت الطائرات من كل أنواع الطائرات الأمريكية الصنع بطبيعة الحال في الجو من فوقنا، أصوات الزنانات الدرون والإف 16 هذه طبعا تقصف في أي لحظة وبشكل متزامن قصير بين أوقات متباعدة قصيرة يعني ومتقاربة أقصد، وربما خلال التسجيل في أي لحظة ستسمعون أصوات انفجارات، وهذه الأصوات تعني بطبيعة الحال دائما أن هناك استهدافا إسرائيليا جديدا، وأن هناك مع الأسف قتلى وجرحى جدد. هذا واقع يومي نعيشه لم يتوقف منذ 1 و8 أشهر. في 19 مايو الماضي قبل أيام نشر الناطق باسم الجيش الإسرائيلي باللغة العربية في صفحته على فيسبوك منشورا مرفقا بخارطة لأحياء مدينة خان يونس، ويوجه في هذا المنشور إنذارا للسكان بهجوم غير مسبوق، ويأمرهم بالإخلاء فورا غربا إلى منطقة المواصي. ويدعي هذا المنشور بأن مدينة خان يونس منذ تلك اللحظة ستعتبر منطقة قتال خطيرة. الخريطة التي نشرها الناطق تظهر غالبية مناطق خان يونس مظللة باللونين الأحمر الفاتح والأحمر الداكن، وهو ما يعني أنها أماكن خطر يجب أن يخرج منها السكان، وهي كما ذكرت معظم أراضي مدينة خان يونس. بينما يشير السهم في ذات الخريطة إلى منطقة المواصي الصغيرة غربا باعتبارها المنطقة الإنسانية التي على السكان التكدس فيها. وطبعا هو أيضا تعبير غير صادق وصف المواصي بأنها منطقة إنسانية، لأن هناك المئات وربما الآلاف قتلوا في هذه المنطقة التي يزعم جيش الاحتلال بأنها إنسانية، قتلوا فيها في غارات مستمرة لا تتوقف. بعد نشر هذا التحذير بساعات قليلة تمتلئ الشوارع في مدينة خان يونس بعشرات الألوف من الهائمين على وجوههم. كتب صديقي الصحفي صالح الناطور ما شاهده في الشوارع في تلك الساعة بالقول: لا أعرف كيف يمكن لصحفي أن يصف كل هذا. رأيت الوجع والقهر يسيران مرة أخرى على هيئة بشر في هذه المدينة. ينزح الناس جماعات من الشرق إلى الغرب كسيل بشري لا ينتهي، أجساد منهكة ضعيفة تترنح كقطع قماش ممزقة مغطاة بغبار الدمار من حولها. سمعت الناس تهذي في الشارع لا تعرف ماذا تقول وإلى أين تذهب. الناس جوعى وعطشى يبحثون عن الماء ويسقطون في الشوارع من التعب والخوف والجوع. حشرنا جميعا الآن في مناطق ضيقة والطائرات فوقنا. الناس تركض في الشوارع والطائرات فوق رؤوسهم. انتهت شهادة صديقي صالح الناطور. أحد المشاهد التي وثقتها الكاميرا كانت لشاب يجر مقعدا لطفل معاق، ويعلق في رقبة الشاب حقيبة صغيرة، ويحمل على ظهره حقيبة أخرى، ويحمل في يده كيسا يبدو فيه رغيفا خبز وربما شيء قليل جدا مما تبقى من طعام في ظل الشح الكبير الذي يعانيه الناس من توفير الغذاء. في منتصف الطريق المجرفة المكسرة بفعل اجتياح إسرائيلي سابق للمدينة، وتحت شمس الظهيرة تنهد قوى هذا الشاب ويتوقف عن دفع عربة الطفل المقعد، ثم يقعد الشاب على الأرض في منتصف الطريق. بجواره امرأة ترتدي ثياب الصلاة. ثياب الصلاة هذا النوع من الثياب المعروف في قطاع غزة بأن النساء يرتدينه عادة على عجل حين لا يكون هناك وقت كاف للاعتناء بالثياب. هذه المرأة التي ترتدي هذه الثياب تحمل في يدها بطانية. تقترب من الشاب، لا أدري ربما أخوها أو ابنها أو ابنها، وتمد يدها تحاول مساعدته لينهض من جديد. تشهق المرأة من البكاء، تختلط كلماتها بدموعها وهي تقول: نحن نموت، لو قتلونا لكان هذا أشد راحة لنا، تعبنا، نحن لسنا حيوانات، نحن بشر. مشهد آخر لطفلة تحمل بضع الحقائب وتسير في الطريق المكسرة فرارا من الموت، فيصورها صحفي بجوارها، فتلتفت إليه وتنفجر في وجهه غاضبة وتقول له: لماذا تصور؟ ولمن تصور؟ ما فائدة تصويرك؟ نحن نموت، كل الناس يعرفون أننا نموت. يسألها الصحفي: إلى أين تتجهين؟ تقول له أيضا بغضب: إلى المواصي، هل هناك مكان آخر؟ هذه الطفلة ذكية جدا، هي تعلم أنه لم يعد هناك جدوى أن يرى العالم موتنا، فالعالم يرى موتنا منذ 1 و8 أشهر ولا يفعل شيئا. لذلك تنفجر الطفلة غاضبة في وجه الكاميرا. مشهد ثالث توثقه الكاميرا لامرأة مريضة ترقد على سرير مستشفى، وفوقها مجموعة من الأغطية، وتتدلى رجلها من على جانب السرير. يجر السرير 4 أشخاص دون أن يستطيعوا دفع هذا السرير، لأن الطريق مكسرة وممتلئة بالركام. يحاولون إبعاد هذه المرأة، ربما أمهم أو جدتهم، يحاولون إبعادها من مكان الخطر. هناك أيضا شهادة أستدل بها للصحفية إيمان بارود التي كتبت: المأساة أعظم من قدرتي اللغوية على التعبير. مرضت من المأساة التي رأيتها في الشوارع، لا أستطيع وصفها. أشعر بالانهيار من مشهد الأمهات والأخوات اللاتي تعبن من المشي، فقررنا النوم على جانبي الشارع العام. نساء تنام في الطرقات من التعب ومن عدم توفر المأوى. تنام هذه النسوة بداخل بسطات الباعة الفارغة مسبقا من السلع. الأطفال أيضا ينامون في الطرقات، رؤوسهم في أحضان أمهاتهم، وباقي أجسادهم الرقيقة النحيلة الجائعة على أرض الرصيف. الشوارع مكتظة بالقهر، مزدحمة بالدموع، لا أحد يرى تعب أحد، كل امرئ يحمل تعبه وهمه على ظهره ويمشي. أنا إيمان بارود عشت كل فصول هذه الحرب، وشربت من كل كؤوس المر فيها. أشهد الله بأني لم أشهد مثل هذه المشاهد المرعبة المفزعة القاتمة والمروعة من قبل. والسلام على قلب الذي يحترق. انتهى الاقتباس من منشور إيمان بارود. هذا المنشور لناطق باسم جيش الاحتلال والأمر بما يسمى الإخلاء، والذي خلق كل هذه المأساة وكل هذا الرعب ليس الأول، بل سبقته عشرات المنشورات المشابهة التي تأمر السكان بترك أحيائهم فورا تحت تهديد الموت. خلال هذه الحرب الإبادية اكتشف جيش الاحتلال أن إجبار أحياء كاملة على النزوح هو وسيلة فاعلة لإبقاء المجتمع الغزي في حالة استنزاف نفسي. كل بضعة أيام يصدر الناطق باسم الجيش في صفحته في فيسبوك منشورا عاجلا يحدد خريطة من الأحياء ويطالب سكانها بمغادرتها فورا. بعد منشور خان يونس بيوم واحد فقط، نشر الناطق باسم جيش الاحتلال منشور إخلاء آخر لمنطقة بيت لاهية في شمال قطاع غزة، وقبله لمناطق في شرق المحافظة الوسطى، وقبله لمناطق في حي الشجاعية في شرق غزة، وهكذا. هي وسيلة مستمرة يستعملها الاحتلال بكفاءة لقتل الناس بالتعب وبالإرهاق وببث ملئهم باليأس وملئهم بالإرهاق. الناس لا تملك خيارا تحت تهديد الموت سوى المسارعة إلى المغادرة، تاركين بيوتهم وممتلكاتهم وراءهم. هناك من السكان من أجبر على النزوح 5 مرات أو 10 أو 20. الأطفال والمرضى يسيرون في الشوارع وهم يقولون: تعبنا، وين الروح؟ وين الروح كلمة شائعة بين النازحين تلخص التعب والتيه وفقدان الأمل. أنهك الناس من النزوح المستمر حتى اضطروا إلى المفاضلة بين ألوان الموت. هناك من قرروا بأن قصف البيوت فوق رؤوسهم والموت في داخل بيوتهم أهون من عذاب النزوح. رحلة النزوح هي قطعة من جهنم حسب وصف من يعايشها. عادة لا تمنح قوات الاحتلال وقتا كافيا للناس للخروج بأريحية. تصدر الأوامر فجأة في أي ساعة من نهار أو ليل، وتكون هذه الأوامر تحت غطاء من القصف المكثف. يسارع الناس إلى تفكيك خيامهم واصطحاب الحد الأدنى من الاحتياجات الأكثر ضرورية والقابلة للحمل، مثل الفراش والأغطية وأوان قليلة للمطبخ وجالونات لتعبئة المياه، وما أمكن من ملابس وحقيبة تحمل الأوراق الضرورية، بينما يتركون وراءهم أكثر أغراضهم لأن الوقت لم يسمح بحملها. يسلك الناس الطريق هائمين لا يعرفون وجهة محددة يأوون إليها، وفي هذه الظروف ليس من اليسير الحصول على مركبة لتحمل الأثقال، فالنازحون بعشرات الألوف على الأقل، وهو ما يفوق القدرة الاستيعابية للمركبات المتوفرة في المكان. وإذا توفرت المركبة فإن تكلفتها الباهظة بسبب شح الوقود تفوق قدرة أكثر العائلات على تحملها. قد تصل تكلفة نقل الأثاث 10,000 من الدولارات. من أين سيأتي الناس بالنقود وهم بلا مصدر دخل؟ لذلك تضطر العائلات إلى قطع كيلومترات طويلة مشيا على الأقدام ومحملة بالأثقال. يتشارك جميع أفراد العائلة في تقاسم الأثقال، الرجال والنساء والأطفال. يحمل الأطفال أثقالا تنوء بهم فيبكون. لا يملك الآباء والأمهات خيارات أمام دموع أطفالهم، فهم يخوضون معركة للبقاء، وكل تأخر يضاعف احتمال الخطر عليهم. تضم كثير من العائلات من بين أفرادها مرضى وكبار سن ومقعدين لا يقدرون على المشي، فيضيف وجودهم ثقلا إضافيا في رحلة النزوح. يضطر الأصحاء من أفراد العائلة إلى جر ذويهم المرضى على مقاعدهم المتحركة إن توفرت، أو أن يحملوهم على أكتافهم إذا انعدمت المقاعد. تغالب العائلات مشقة الطريق في صراعها الفطري للبقاء. بعد قطع ساعات من المشي ترتمي العائلات في أقرب مكان يتوهمون أنه أقل خطرا. قد يرمون أنفسهم في فناء مستشفى أو قطعة أرض فارغة أو على الرصيف، ويبدأون نصب خيامهم من جديد. ما يزيد النزوح مأساوية أن تقطع على المرء طريق العودة. كنا ننزح في البداية على أمل أن هذه الحرب ستنتهي بعد أسابيع أو شهور، ثم نرجع إلى الاستقرار في بيوتنا، لكن تدمير البيوت هو قطع نهائي لأمل الرجوع إلى الاستقرار. أكثر أهل غزة الآن يخوضون معركة كل يوم بيومه من أجل الإفلات من الموت فقط. لا يرون أي أفق لمستقبلهم، فقد خسروا بيوتهم وكل أملاكهم، كما تفيد التقارير بأنه ما لا يقل عن 80 أو ربما 90% من بيوت قطاع غزة قد دمرت. هناك أهالي مدينة رفح على سبيل المثال خرجوا قبل أكثر من عام من الآن بأمر إخلاء من الجيش الإسرائيلي، ومر أكثر من عام ولم يعودوا إلى بيوتهم، وقد دمرت رفح بشكل كامل، فانقطع أملهم في العودة إلى بيوتهم التي أجبروا على تركها. فقدان البيت ليس أمرا يسيرا، فقدان البيت يعني فقدان الاستقرار النفسي. التهجير القسري المستمر من مكان إلى مكان يجمع بين العذاب المادي والعذاب النفسي والعبء المالي. لا يحتمل كثيرون قسوة طريق النزوح، يقعون على وجوههم من شدة التعب والجوع، ينامون على الرصيف أو يغمى عليهم في منتصف الطريق لأن طاقتهم نفدت تماما، لم يعودوا قادرين على المواصلة. ليس عبثا أن يردد كثيرون من الغزيين هذه الأيام: إن الموت أهون من النزوح.
Thank you, Nimer, for coming back to join us. I'm going to ask a question or two of Nimer, and we're going to invite any questions coming from the audience to Nimer with respect to his presentation on genocide. My first question to you, Nimer, is why are these terms, apartheid and genocide, so important in understanding Palestine? People, you and I, and Susan are all scholars in international law, and we feel probably comfortable in using these. How are people who are not legal experts going to feel about trying to use such explosive terms if they wind up getting challenged on those? And if the goal for many of us is for a free Palestine, does it not complicate the struggle for basic rights to use terms like apartheid and genocide, which are contentious in the public sphere?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the public discourse, at least in Western countries, with respect to the situation in Palestine, is that we have heard the argument repeatedly throughout decades about different concepts, including apartheid, that they are counterproductive, that they are controversial, why to use them, etc. But I think these arguments are arguments that try to delay outrage at the situation, to quell our sense of discomfort about the situation, and therefore to delay action with respect to these concepts. And the difficulty with lack of naming is that you end up with talking about the trees for decades, and you'd never notice, name, and highlight the forest. So we had decades of reports about restrictions to the right of movement and checkpoints. We had decades of reports about torture, about particular campaigns or particular strikes and their proportionality and distinctions. So a lot of people in the human rights community and legal academia have been too comfortable with the technical, depoliticized legal discourse that focuses on desperate actions rather than on the general situation. The historical comparisons to apartheid, the legal standards that are named in international conventions about apartheid, war crimes, crimes against humanity, are ways in which we encapsulate the situation. Instead of giving a 50-minute lecture, you with one word, you can encapsulate what is legally and morally wrong in the situation. But I wanted to add one thing that also connects maybe my presentation to Victor's presentation. I think we need to be clear that many of these concepts are, they highlight different aspects of the situation, but they don't necessarily capture the full wrongness of the situation. So we saw, for example, that when Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International eventually said apartheid in detailed reports, they said it without saying colonialism. So there's always some limitation. But more importantly, If you look at what the South African activists against apartheid have been telling us for decades, the Israeli occupation is much more brutal than the South African apartheid. So I'm going to give you 3 examples in which the Israeli apartheid and occupation is worse than the South African apartheid. Ronnie Castri, for example, said 19 years ago, before the genocide, etc., quote, "This is much worse than apartheid. The Israeli measures, the brutality, make apartheid look like a picnic. We never had jets attacking our townships. We never had sieges that lasted month after month. We never had tanks destroying houses. We had armored vehicles and police using small arms to shoot people, but not on this scale." So even when we call it apartheid, we need to make sure that we understand that the occupation is much more brutal than the South African apartheid ever was. Secondly, in terms of discrimination, including against Palestinians who are inside Israel, and this is something also some human rights organizations have been reluctant to say when they extended the analogy or the charge of apartheid. While the apartheid court in South Africa protected in 1982 in a case called Komanino versus Bantu administration the right of blacks to family life and struck down governmental regulations that violated it, the Israeli Supreme Court twice in 2006 and 2012 sanctioned or legalized the law banning family unification. Palestinian citizens, and only them, cannot naturalize their spouses inside Israel if the spouses were residents of the Palestinian territories or other adjacent Arab countries. Thirdly, the fact that by legislation, most of the land of Israel is reserved for use by Jews is comparable to the legislation in South Africa when apartheid was instituted. The Native Land Act of 1913 in South Africa set aside 7% of the territory for Africans and prohibited them from acquiring land in the other 93%. The 1936 Native Trust and Land Act increased the amount of land available to Africans to 13%. So the South African law under apartheid protected the 13% as indigenous land, while the Israeli legislation excludes the indigenous population from the settlers' land, but does not exclude the settlers from the indigenous land. So in this respect, Israel's land tenure system is less favorable to the indigenous population than South Africa's. And John Quigley mentioned that in the 1990s in one of his articles about apartheid outside South Africa. So I think we need to be aware that these concepts are also sometimes limited in describing the horror, but they are a good start, and avoiding them is one way of avoiding the full scale of the horror.
Thanks a lot. I am here representing the Permanent People's Tribunal. I congratulate for all this initiative and what Richard was saying in the beginning, that the importance is to make something which is actuated while the process of apartheid, of genocide is ongoing. But I refer back to what you have said before, that the main point of your presentation at the beginning was just that it is time to give a name to what is happening. Now, from what we have heard, and I think that many things have been repeated, the name has been given, and what you have said now on apartheid, the name has been given many times, as is worse or not what. But if the system, we should be the judge of that, is in fact well aware of what we are presenting, you are presenting. Don't you think that would be important also to include in the attention of the Gaza Tribunal, I don't know how, but as a center, that the Israeli case, because everybody is clearly saying what is happening to victims, but the state community, which is represented by Israeli, why is not something which could be done? Because you can't deny from the state point of view, also international court, but also the United Nations. So just to make into or introduce formally in the analysis that something should be done if we have to do for the future. Otherwise, what is happening in Gaza in an exemplary way could be repeated and is being repeated. We had a tribunal on Rojava when it was starting. Now it's going on and on and on, but is now no more debated as a genocide because a small part is a geopolitical problem. So this link between the geopolitical disorder and what is the clear evidence in Gaza, I think that would be important to be introduced as a central role of this tribunal in order to be really a contribution to make Gaza a case for the future, at least, not only for the Palestinians, but for the way of considering international law.
Agreed. I mean, I guess I would say two things. One of the reasons that we can add for why there is a delay of naming the condition is that once UN officials or Western governments say it's a genocide, this will implicate them in the complicity in the genocide. And this will, now it's almost kind of too late. But if they had said genocide from the beginning, this will mean that they have a duty to prevent genocide legally according to the Genocide Convention. And the lack of naming is also an abdication of this duty or this obligation to prevent genocide, as well as attempt to conceal their own complicity in the genocide itself. So I suspect for a long time there will be many institutions and governments that will still deny genocide because they were the cheerleaders of the genocide. They have no interest or incentive of actually accepting or recognizing and acknowledging the genocide and their responsibility for it. Secondly, but as you truly pointed out, is that if this is allowed to happen, then obviously there might be future cases in which the oppressed, the colonized, the subaltern of this world will be slaughtered in this way, in daylight, and kicked out of their house and houses and homelands in mass. And obviously all the legal structures that we have will be meaningless unless they are reasserted now, unless they are reformed in ways that will make them more effective when future atrocities happen. And we can't wait till the ICJ, in 5 years' time or so, says that it's a genocide and therefore there were violations of the relevant legal documents. Obviously, the ICJ and the different mechanisms we have today failed in preventing genocide, failed in ending these atrocities, and therefore they are too late for too many and so many people. And we need to reform the legal system that allowed it to happen.
Questions from the audience?
Thank you. I have a follow-up on this question. If the ICJ issues a ruling that says this is genocide, what would be the implications for the states that have signed on or part of the ICJ, and what would be the implications for those who haven't? And are there any obligations on the people themselves, or it's just the states?
Well, so we need a distinction between the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. So individual responsibility is the purview of the International Criminal Court. So if the prosecutor presents indictments or charges against Israeli leaders, Israeli soldiers with the charge of genocide, it will be handled by the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice is about state responsibility. So the decision will be related to whether Israel as a state is responsible for genocide. And then that might have implications for other states. Like now there's a case, as that was mentioned, Nicaragua faces, by Victor, I think, Nicaragua faces Germany, that relates to these issues, which is questions of complicity of states. And obviously, the implication of naming it as a genocide will mean that all the states that are members of the Genocide Convention and have accepted the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice had a duty to prevent genocide. They haven't exercised it when it mattered.
What does it mean? They have a duty. What does it mean? They can do. For example, is what the Houthis doing legal if they're trying to prevent genocide?
But this is not now under the discussion in the court itself. So that's a separate
That's
matter.
why I asked the question. What if they rule that this is genocide? Does that mean that if states wage a war against Israel, would that be legal war?
Well, I think, there's a plausible argument that actors that are, when kind of Yugoslavia happened, for example, it was the action that was even illegal formally was presented as a humanitarian intervention. When Libya happened, it was presented also by Western states as a humanitarian intervention. So there's a plausible argument that actors like Yemen, who are taking actions in the defense of Gaza, might be understood as exercising the duty to prevent genocide, so long to the extent that they are members of the Genocide Convention.
What about complicitous parties like the U.S.? What would be the implications for that?
The U.S. has not accepted the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, so it cannot be brought to the court without their own consent.
Israel didn't accept either. I mean, Israel is not part of this.
Yeah, but the Palestinian Authority accepted, and the acts are committed on the territory of Palestine.
What about the case of, say...
Sorry, actually, the Israel did accept the jurisdiction of genocide and the ICJ, unlike the U.S.
What about the case of America isn't, but Britain is party to the Genocide Convention? What are the implications for British Prime Ministers and military leaders? And, of course, is it retrospective? Does it sort of apply when, in sometime in the 22nd century? Is it First of all, what are the implications for British Prime Ministers and military leaders? Because we are party. And also, is it retrospective, i.e. when in some time in the 22nd century, when the ICJ gets around to making its mind up, will there be retrospective consequences for those who, in my country, who have ordered and been part of what seems to be a genocide in Gaza?
Well, the short answer is that at the moment, these consequences that might be retrospective will hopefully be political. But so long as the ICC prosecutor did not bring charges against these leaders for violations of the law that relate to what happened in genocide, they will be only political. And unless another state brings a case like Nicaragua did against Germany, a case against the UK, again, these will be theoretical, academic, and perhaps political, but not legal.
Maybe I could add to that. There is, though, the possibility of any state, individual state, under their domestic proceedings, to bring charges against any individual leader, and the Genocide Convention does not provide immunity to leaders, even while they are sitting in their leadership capacity. It's an exception to the usual immunity rules. So any state could bring criminal proceedings against Keir Starmer, for example, or we hope Joe Biden. And in some states, individuals can initiate those proceedings. In other states, individuals cannot. But so there are states, including several European states, that have very liberal proceedings for universal jurisdiction. U.S. does not have anything like this. We have extremely restrictive possibilities under what could be called universal jurisdiction. We just don't have it in the U.S. It has to be brought by the state. But so there are plenty of possibilities. I mean, proceedings were brought against Kissinger. They've been brought against George Bush. They've been brought, I mean, they weren't successful because they didn't come onto the territory where warrants could have been issued. But this is all work that needs to be done and will be done given the unbelievable amount of legal activity that is going on around this genocide that I've certainly never seen in my professional lifetime about any other situation. Targeting individual soldiers who have been basically promoting their genocidal acts, proceedings being brought against various political actors, and I think this is only going to accelerate as time goes on and as more evidence becomes available. Yes, so we have one final, and before lunch we have one final video to show you, thanks to Al-Haq, and I think it's ready to go.